First, let's discuss economic stratification trends in the 1990s and early 21st century. During the 1990s and into the 21st century, there was the emergence of a winner-take-all mentality in American business and public life. The U.S. has become the most economically stratified industrial nation as our social classes are separated and there is a greater gap between the rich and the poor. This is shown in the fact that only a tiny fraction of the population controls a large part of America's wealth and financial resources. In the 1990s, the number of wealthy families in the U.S. increased, but the number of families living in poverty did not decrease, and the poverty rate hardly fluctuated. Starting in the 1990s, the middle class was declining, and there was a growing concern about the ability of the middle class to make ends meet, as they did not have the same income increases as the rich. There was a cascading effect where what the wealthiest spent their money on influenced the spending patterns of the group below them and caused the community expectation for the middle class to rise. Overall, more and more individuals became extremely wealthy and were caught up in what the economist Robert Frank described as luxury fever, which is a rage to spend wildly on vehicles, clothing, toys, hobbies, and more. On the other hand, poor neighborhoods often lack the most minimal resources for play and school.
In the late 1980s, there was a pronounced shift towards more social and conservative economic policies. Then, in the mid-1990s, there were renewed efforts to open the nation's parks and forests to economic exploitation. This would help lessen the support for environmental education programs. When Obama was elected in 2009, it helped to loosen growing social conservatism. This meant that the arts turned more into private funding, which caused a widespread decline for important public services. And in a 2019 poll, only 17% of the respondents said that they trusted the federal government to do the right thing. Overall, social conservatism is becoming much more prominent and changing the world we know today.
In the 1990s, commodification and privatization of leisure services became very popular. Commodification describes the process of taking any product or service and commercializing it by designing and marketing it to yield the greatest degree of financial return or profit. Places like art museums, libraries, theaters, orchestras, and ballet companies all have become centers of popular entertainment and have embraced commodification in the effort to gain fuller financial support in an increasingly consumer-oriented society. Privatization refers to the growing practice.
It has been almost 140 years in the United States since the beginning of organized recreation, and methods are constantly changing. In the past, fees barely existed, but now public agencies depend on fees and charges to make up 90% of their operating budgets. As the park and recreation industry grows, agencies can no longer accommodate everyone who wants or needs the services. So nonprofit and commercial agencies are having to step in. Oftentimes, nonprofit and public agencies do not have the resources, money, or ability to respond quickly, which creates a lack in the services. The leisure services field is changing, but the growth is restricted in public and nonprofit agencies due to financial capital, public interest, and politics. The parks, recreation centers, fields, and cultural centers developed do not have the ability to respond to change quickly. New young leaders are stepping into the recreation industry, and they are changing traditional approaches to leisure as the world progresses and more variety of leisure activities are demanded.
Because of the unknown environmental disasters in the early 18 and 1900s, the nation recovered polluted areas as well as implementing protection plans moving forward. The National Park System and other parks implemented small fees in order to help protect the lands. The National Park Trust was created to acquire new parks and wildlife. In metropolitan cities such as Baltimore and Boston, they changed their unused industrial areas into museums, aquariums, sports stadiums, theme parks, and more, all to attract more tourists to their cities. There were lots made from the limited and decreased use of industrial factories. Technology also had huge impacts on leisure. For instance, the cars now had GPSs and made it so that families could take road trips completely in their own automobile. Car stereos and TV screens were also added and became new forms of entertainment for families while driving. As far as televisions, home theater systems with controlled lighting, Blu-rays, surround sound, large screens, and window shades were created to give a more personal feel. Video games also became super popular in the late 90s, and the next page actually contains graphics for a more visual understanding of the important impact TVs had on people's entertainment. Internet and computers also became super popular and made TV usage more available with streaming sites like Netflix and Hulu. At the time of this book being published, it was assumed that 3.5 hours a month was spent on watching videos through handheld devices. However, the current data from Julia Jacobo at ABC News suggests that teens now spend around 7 hours a day on their devices, meaning their video watching most likely exceeds 3.5 hours a month. The graph on the left shows that Americans and their cable usage by the late 1900s, which showed that about 80% had cable, while 20% went without it. And the graph on the right shows that Americans' free time changed drastically, and by the late 1900s, about 40 of them were watching TV in their free time, while the other 60% decided to do something else.
As recognized by public officials, the rate of obesity is increasing, and unfortunately, in childhood obesity, student time for physical education classes, recess, and outdoors has been cut back. Recreation and leisure service providers and the federal government are taking action to recognize the importance in encouraging physical activity in communities. Nonprofits are working to help with the increasing issue of childhood obesity by focusing on fitness programs and the lack of children's engagement outdoors. As the population continues to change, culturally and age-wise, leisure service providers will have to adapt to the new desires and needs from people. Traditional recreational programs will have to reassess the cultural framework that prompts the leisure services today.